Hey there, welcome back to Animal Quests. I'm Austin. Today, we are covering 6 fatal attacks, all of them in shallow water. From an experienced electrician who stepped briefly into a river to free a snagged fishing line, to a wildlife photographer who moved just a few feet beyond a designated viewing area to get a cleaner shot. Let's start with a primary school teacher who walked a few steps into a familiar shoreline to guide her child back to safety and never made it back to shore. It was September 23, 2017, along the southern shore of Lake Kariba, Zimbabwe. The afternoon heat pressed down on the water, leaving the surface almost glassy and completely still. Families had gathered near a commonly used fishing access point along the shoreline, an area residents had used for years, despite occasional crocodile sightings in the wider lake. Children ran along the bank while adults spread out nearby, close enough to watch, but far enough from the water's edge to feel comfortable. Tonderai Morcio was 38 years old, a primary school teacher known throughout her small fishing community for her patience and reliability. She had grown up near this lake and raised her 3 children in the same village where she had spent her entire life. People who knew her described her as dependable, someone who showed up early, stayed late, and always made sure the people around her were safe. That detail matters because it explains exactly why she did what she did that afternoon. No recent attacks had been reported along that specific section of shoreline, and over time, many residents had come to view it as relatively safe compared to more isolated stretches of the lake. People still moved carefully near the water. This was crocodile country, and everyone understood that, but the access point had become routine. I think that slow drift from caution to comfort is something that happens in almost every place where people and dangerous animals share the same space for long enough. The absence of incidents starts to feel like evidence of safety, even when it isn't. That afternoon, Tonderai noticed her young son had wandered too far into the shallows. She stood up and walked toward him. Witnesses later estimated the water reached only around knee-height at the point where she entered. She was not swimming. She was not taking what anyone would recognize as a risk. She was simply moving toward her child. What nobody on the bank knew was that a submerged channel ran parallel to the shoreline just a few yards beyond where the children were playing, a narrow drop-off where the lake bed fell away quickly from the shallows into much deeper water. That kind of transition is exactly where large Nile crocodiles wait. Several fishermen later told investigators that they had occasionally seen crocodiles moving through deeper water near that channel, but none had been observed close to shore that day. Large Nile crocodiles in Lake Kariba commonly exceed 10 feet in length, with some individuals growing considerably larger. They are ambush hunters, built to be invisible in water. They can hold position below the surface for extended periods without creating any visible disturbance, and when they move fast, an explosive surge that closes distance before a person can register what is happening. They seize prey, drag it toward depth, and use a rolling technique that overpowers resistance almost immediately. Tonderai had nearly reached her son and was guiding him back toward shore when the crocodile struck from the direction of the channel. It seized her and knocked her off balance instantly. Relatives rushed toward the water. Several men grabbed rocks and sticks, while others scrambled toward a nearby fishing boat. The child, already being guided back, was clear of the water before the full weight of what was happening registered on the bank, but Tonderai was not. The crocodile rolled, pulling her away from the shallows and toward the drop-off. Her children and several family members witnessed the initial attack before Tonderai disappeared beneath the surface. I have thought about this more than once. She walked into that water to guide her child to safety. There was no hesitation and no pause, just a mother stepping toward her son, and nobody was watching the water with the level of caution the lake demanded, because that stretch of shore had felt safe for years. Search teams began patrolling by boat before sunset that same evening. Recovery efforts continued for 4 days. On September 27th, her remains were located several kilometers from the point of the attack. Wildlife officers stated that the condition of the remains was consistent with crocodile predation. After that length of time in the lake, no further determination was possible. In the weeks that followed, local wildlife officers launched renewed safety campaigns reminding residents that Nile crocodiles frequently attack from shallow water near drop-offs and submerged channels, and that areas without recent incidents are not necessarily safe. Tonderai's story is a reminder of how ordinary the moment before a fatal attack usually looks. But shoreline attacks, as devastating as they are, at least give bystanders a chance to react. The next story involves a setting where no one on the bank could reach the victim in time, and where the water itself made escape nearly impossible from the very first second. It was July 14, 2019. Along a stretch of the Adelaide River in the Northern Territory, Australia. The dry season had left the riverbanks exposed and cracked at the edges, with dense vegetation pressing close to the water on both sides. The river moved slowly, the kind of quiet that makes a place feel undisturbed, even when it isn't. Brett Kavanagh was 41 years old, a commercial electrician based out of Darwin, who regularly traveled to remote communities across northern Australia for work. Years of camping, fishing, and moving through wetlands had made him deeply comfortable in environments that would intimidate most people. Friends described him as calm and experienced, the kind of person others naturally deferred to in unfamiliar territory because he always seemed to know what he was doing. I think his reputation mattered because it explains why no one questioned him that afternoon. When someone has a lot of experience, people tend to trust their judgment without much hesitation, and that can make a bigger difference than most realize. That weekend, Brett was fishing with two co-workers along a muddy bank downriver from a bend in the Adelaide River, a waterway with a well-documented history of large saltwater crocodile activity. The group cast into slower water near submerged structures where fish tend to gather. The spot wasn't unmarked or unfamiliar territory. People across the Northern Territory understand that saltwater crocodiles use these rivers year-round, and Adelaide in particular is one of the most active crocodile corridors in the country. But productive fishing spots pull people in, and experienced outdoorsmen often accept a degree of proximity to known risk when the conditions feel manageable. I think that's a trade-off a lot of people can relate to. Looking back, it seems like an obvious mistake, but at the moment it probably just felt like a great afternoon on the water. As the afternoon progressed, Brett hooked a large fish that became tangled in submerged branches close to the bank. Rather than cut the line, he stepped into knee-to-thigh deep water to work the fish free. His focus was entirely on the line, and his attention was fixed downward. He was not watching the river. His two co-workers were standing several yards further along the bank, far enough that reaching him quickly was not possible. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile on Earth. Males in the Adelaide River commonly reach 13 to 15 feet in length and can weigh well over 1,000 pounds. They are opportunistic hunters with a documented tendency to move through shallow margins and investigate disturbance near the bank. A large individual shifting from a deeper channel toward the shoreline would produce almost no visible surface movement before the strike. The crocodile came from the direction of the main channel and seized Brett before either coworker could react. By the time they reached the water's edge, Brett had already disappeared beneath the surface. There was nothing within reach and nothing left to see. I don't think that moment ends differently. Once a large saltwater crocodile gets hold of someone in open water, the odds of survival are incredibly low. What makes cases like this especially hard is that the people watching had no real way to help, yet they still had to live with what they saw. Emergency services and wildlife officers were contacted immediately and began search operations that same evening. Search teams located human remains downstream the following day, allowing formal identification to proceed. Investigators noted that entering the water near a deep river channel in known crocodile habitat had significantly increased risk, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. No footage of the attack was recorded. His two co-workers provided written accounts to wildlife investigators, and the case was referred to the Northern Territory coroner for formal investigation. In the months that followed, the incident was referenced in crocodile safety messaging distributed to workers and visitors traveling through the top end, reinforcing that saltwater crocodiles along the Adelaide River are permanent residents of the waterway, not seasonal visitors, and that any water entry, regardless of depth or duration, carries serious risk. Brett knew this country better than most people who fish the Northern Territory. That knowledge made no difference once something underneath the water had already decided to move. That's the part I can't quite let go of. Brett's story shows how quickly expertise becomes irrelevant when the environment stops cooperating. But the next account is different. The setting isn't a remote river or a known crocodile corridor. It's a place so routine, so woven into the rhythms of everyday life, that the victim had stood at that same water's edge dozens of times before without a second thought. And that familiarity is exactly what made it fatal. It was September 21st, 2022, along the lower reaches of the Tarcoles River in Punta Arenas province, Costa Rica. The wet season had pushed the river toward its banks, and the air carried that particular heaviness that settles over the Pacific lowlands after weeks of rain, thick, warm, and completely still. A small community boat launch near the river's edge served as the gathering point for a family get-together that afternoon, the kind of informal event that fills an unexpected day off without much planning. Mariah Gutierrez was 36 years old, a tour coordinator for a small regional travel company based in the Central Valley. For years, her work had taken her to river communities, wildlife areas, and coastal zones across Costa Rica, environments where dangerous animals were a daily consideration for the people who lived and worked there. She had organized dozens of river excursions along crocodile-inhabited waterways, briefed visitors on wildlife safety, and watched American crocodiles from boat decks more times than she could count. I think that kind of familiarity is complicated. It builds experience, but it can also slowly wear down the caution that keeps people safe. When you've been around crocodile habitat enough times without a problem, the danger stops feeling immediate, and that shift can happen so gradually you barely notice it. The Tarcoles River is one of the most crocodile-dense waterways in Central America. The lower section near the Pacific estuary supports a large resident population of American crocodiles, and the stretch around the boat launch had a reputation among local fishermen for consistent crocodile presence. Most people who use the launch regularly regularly were aware of this. Mariah was not unaware. She simply had never personally experienced anything close to a dangerous encounter, and years without a close call had gradually softened the edge of her awareness in ways she likely never noticed. I don't think that's unusual. Most people judge risk based on their own experiences rather than the actual danger. In places where the threat is real but rarely seen, that can be a surprisingly dangerous habit. That afternoon, as the gathering wound down and relatives began packing up, Mariah volunteered to rinse several large containers that had been used earlier to store raw fish and bait. She carried them to the edge of the boat launch and stepped into ankle-to-calf deep water at the concrete ramp, crouching down to work the residue from the containers. Her attention was focused entirely on the task. She was still, low to the water, and close to the river's edge. Exactly the kind of profile that places a person within range of a large crocodile already occupying that stretch of bank. American crocodiles, Crocodylus acutus, are the dominant crocodilian species along Costa Rica's Pacific coastal waterways and estuaries. Adults in the Tarcoles River system commonly reach 10 to 13 feet in length, with larger individuals documented near the lower estuary. While American crocodiles are sometimes described as less aggressive toward humans than their Nile or saltwater counterparts, that distinction carries little practical weight at close range. They are ambush predators that use shallow margins, ramp edges, and vegetated banks as holding positions, and a large individual occupying the water beside an active boat launch would be entirely invisible from above the surface. Attacks in these situations are driven by proximity and opportunity, rather than any single factor. The fish residue in the containers may have contributed to the crocodile's continued interest in the ramp area, but the primary risk was straightforward. Mariah was crouching at the water's edge, close to a large predator that had likely been using that shoreline long before anyone arrived that afternoon. The animal struck from alongside the ramp with almost no warning. It seized her from the side before she had any time to register movement, and the force knocked her off the ramp and into the shallow water beside it. Witnesses on shore reacted immediately, but the speed of the attack had already separated her from anyone who could physically reach her. The crocodile pulled her away from the ramp and toward deeper portions of the channel. What stands out most is how routine the task was. She wasn't swimming or crossing the river. She was standing at a launch ramp doing something countless people had done before. The danger wasn't in the containers themselves, but in how close the task put her to a predator that had likely been using that shoreline long before anyone arrived that afternoon. Nearby, fishermen and family members moved toward the water immediately, but she had been pulled well past any point of intervention within seconds. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Recovery teams located her remains downstream the following morning. Wildlife officials concluded that the victim had entered a known crocodile use area while handling fishing materials at the water's edge. The condition of the remains was consistent with a fatal crocodile attack, and no further formal determination was possible given the recovery timeline. In the weeks that followed, local wildlife officers visited boat launches and fishing access points along the lower Tarcoles corridor, distributing advisories warning against any direct water contact at ramps during active fishing periods. Several launches later posted notices reinforcing that the river's edge, including the concrete ramp surface itself, should be treated as crocodile habitat at all times. Mariah's story stays with me because of how incidental the whole thing was. She wasn't taking a risk she had consciously weighed. She was doing a small, useful task that probably took less than 5 minutes, and the river made no distinction between that and anything else crouching near its edge. The Tarcoles attack shows how simply being near the water can be enough. The next story shifts to a quiet canal that most people barely notice, and a man who had fished there so many times that he never saw the danger coming. It was May 12, 2020. Along a canal system on the western edge of the Everglades region in Florida. The morning had already turned warm by the time the sun cleared the tree line, burning off the thin mist that sat over the water most weekends at that hour. The canal ran straight and slow between grassy banks, the kind of unremarkable waterway that blends into the landscape so completely that most people stop registering it as anything beyond scenery. Jackson Reynolds was 29 years old, a construction supervisor from a mid-sized contracting company that worked residential projects across Broward and Miami-Dade counties. His work weeks were long and physical, and weekend fishing had become the one routine that gave him reliable time away from job sites. He had fished the same canal system for several years, arriving early enough to have a few hours before the heat peaked. People who worked with him described him as focused and efficient, someone who approached most things methodically, including fishing. Over those years, Jackson had seen alligators in and around the canal regularly. He had watched them from the bank, noted their size, and moved his position when one came too close. He had never experienced a dangerous encounter. That track record had quietly changed the way he related to the canal, not through carelessness exactly, but through the kind of accumulated comfort that makes a place feel predictable when it isn't. That morning, he had done well. Several fish were laid out beside him on the bank by mid-morning, and before heading home, he began cleaning his catch at the water's edge, a routine he had performed at the same spot before. He worked worked kneeling at the canal bank, discarding fish remains and offal directly into the water beside him. The activity created a concentrated release of blood, tissue, and scent into the slow-moving canal. His focus was entirely on the task. American alligators, Alligator mississippiensis, are found throughout Florida's canal systems, drainage channels, and retention ponds, including waterways that run directly alongside residential and suburban areas. Adults commonly reach 10 to 13 feet in length and can weigh between 400 and 800 pounds. They are opportunistic ambush predators that frequently move through canal systems during warmer months and are responsive to biological material entering the water. A large individual moving through the canal that morning would likely have been drawn toward the disturbance from elsewhere in the canal. In Florida's murky canal water, an alligator approaching from even a short distance away produces almost no visible surface indication of its presence. Jackson was still kneeling at the bank when the alligator erupted from the canal edge, seizing him by the arm and upper torso before dragging him down the bank and into the water. Nearby anglers positioned further along the bank witnessed the strike and immediately called emergency services. None of them were close enough to intervene before he disappeared beneath the surface. It was over before anyone standing on that bank could have done anything meaningful, and that is not a detail that makes it easier to sit with. Search teams reached the canal within the hour and conducted an extensive search of the waterway. Jackson's remains were recovered later that afternoon, a short distance from the point of the attack. Medical investigators concluded that injuries sustained were consistent with an alligator attack, with traumatic injury and drowning both contributing to death. Wildlife officers responding to the scene later removed several large alligators from the area, including one measuring approximately 13 feet. In the weeks following the incident, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission officers distributed warnings to anglers using canal systems across the region, emphasizing that fish cleaning activities at the water's edge represent one of the most consistent behavioral risk factors in alligator incidents. Several access points along the canal system were later posted with advisories warning against handling or discarding fish material at the waterline. The canal had been part of Jackson's routine for years, and nothing about that morning looked different from any other weekend until it was. A familiar place and a familiar task, and neither offered any warning before the water moved. The Everglades Canal shows how quickly a known environment can turn fatal during a routine moment. But the next story leaves Florida entirely and moves to a setting that feels even more controlled, a region of Nigeria's Niger River, where one man's decades of experience on the water should have made him the least likely victim on that shoreline. It didn't. It was November 6, 2021, along the Niger River in Delta State, Nigeria. The harmattan had not yet arrived in full, but the late afternoon light already carried that flattened orange quality that comes before the dry season pushes in from the north. Along the Niger, daylight drops quickly in November. The surface darkens, the banks lose definition, and the line between shallow water and deep channel becomes difficult to read, even for people who have spent their lives on this river. Samuel Okoro was 48 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades operating a small river transport business along the Niger. He moved cargo between riverside communities using a flat-bottomed vessel, work that keeps irregular hours and demands physical reliability above almost everything else. Co-workers and regular clients described him as methodical and dependable, the kind of man who finished what he started without needing direction or supervision. Honestly, that dependability is exactly what kept him at the bank alone after everyone else had already left. Samuel was known for staying behind after group unloading jobs to clean equipment and secure the vessel before heading home. Nobody around him had ever flagged it as a risk, but one pattern co-workers had noticed over the years was that Samuel regularly completed waterside tasks alone, even along stretches of the Niger where crocodile activity had been discussed. It had never become a problem before that evening. That's the thing. The habit that gets someone killed is almost never something new. It's something they've done 100 times without anything going wrong. That history is what makes it feel safe. The cargo landing where Samuel worked that evening sloped gradually from firm ground into shallow water, less than waist deep at the bank's edge. Unremarkable shoreline, gently angled, accessible. Nothing about it that announces danger. The rest of the crew had already cleared out. Samuel stayed behind to rinse equipment at the water's edge. He was still there as visibility dropped and crocodile activity along the Niger typically increased. Large crocodiles inhabiting the Niger River system commonly exceed 10 feet in length, while exceptional individuals reach substantially greater sizes. Both species are documented ambush hunters, most active during dawn and dusk hour. During low light, they move into extremely shallow water along gently sloping banks, where murky water and poor visibility make detection almost impossible even from a short distance. A large animal holding position along a dark, muddy bank at dusk would have been completely invisible to someone focused on equipment at the waterline. The crocodile struck from the shallow margin of the bank. Samuel shouted. Workers positioned upstream heard it and moved toward the landing immediately. By the time they reached the bank, the attack had already fully unfolded. There was no ongoing struggle to interrupt. The water at the shoreline showed disturbance consistent with a recent violent event, but Samuel was already gone. The part I can't shake is the timing. The work was done. He was minutes from leaving. That detail changes nothing about the outcome, but it's hard to set aside. A search of the surrounding river began that evening and continued for 2 full days. Searchers, assisted by local boat operators and community members, located his remains approximately 2 miles downstream on November 8th. The condition of the remains was consistent with a fatal crocodile attack. Based on the crocodile populations known to inhabit that section of the Niger, authorities believed a large crocodile was responsible, though no formal species determination was made. No witnesses had observed the strike directly, and no footage of the incident existed. In the days that followed, community leaders and local transport operators began emphasizing the dangers of working alone near the riverbank at dusk, holding informal meetings among crews who use that section of the Niger regularly. Workers who had previously stayed behind alone to finish waterside tasks began completing them in pairs before the light dropped. Samuel knew that river better than most people will ever know any place. Honestly, that knowledge was real, but it was built around what he had experienced, not around what the river was capable of. Those aren't the same thing. Samuel's story is a reminder that decades on the water build confidence far more reliably than they build safety. But the next account involves someone who was paying careful attention to her surroundings, someone whose entire focus that afternoon was on observing the environment around her. And that focused attention is exactly what made her miss the one thing that mattered. It was January 18th, 2017, along the St. Lucia estuary in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The height of the southern hemisphere summer had pushed temperatures into the low 90s by mid-morning, and the air above the estuary carried that dense, wet heat that settles over coastal wetlands at the peak of the season. Wading birds moved slowly along the reed margins, and the surface of the estuary reflected a flat, pale sky. For a wildlife photographer, it was exactly the kind of morning worth waking up early for. Rebecca Lawson was 33 years old, a physical therapist from the American Midwest who had spent years setting aside time and money for a wildlife photography trip to southern Africa. She had traveled with her family and brought serious equipment, a telephoto lens, a stabilizing tripod, and enough storage to shoot through an entire week without stopping. Friends described her as patient and methodical, someone who would hold a single position for an hour waiting for the right frame. She had photographed wildlife across several states before this trip and considered herself careful around natural environments. Several days into the trip, the family stopped at a designated viewing area overlooking a section of the estuary shoreline, an established stopping point used by birders and wildlife visitors, positioned to allow views across the reed margins without requiring direct contact with the bank. The St. Lucia estuary supports one of the largest estuarine crocodile populations in southern Africa, and the combination of shallow feeding zones, dense reed beds, and internal tidal channels creates conditions favorable for both significant waterbird activity and large resident crocodiles. Warnings about maintaining distance from the reed margins were posted at the viewing area. Rebecca had spent the early part of the morning working through her telephoto lens from within the viewing area, shooting birds feeding along the reed line. At some point, a large wading bird she had been tracking began moving behind a curtain of reeds, repeatedly disappearing before she could get a clean frame. The angle from the viewing area placed vegetation directly between her lens and the subject. She moved beyond the designated area and along the bank to find a gap in the reeds that gave her a direct line of sight. When she found the angle she needed, she crouched, set the tripod, and raised the camera to her eye. Honestly, it is a decision any photographer would recognize. One small adjustment to get the shot. That is what makes it so hard to read. While adjusting the tripod, Rebecca shifted one knee toward the reed edge and leaned forward to frame the bird through a gap in the vegetation. That movement brought part of her body within feet of the channel margin hidden inside the reed bed. Witnesses later stated she never appeared to notice the crocodile before it attacked. Nile crocodiles in the St. Lucia estuary system commonly reach 10 to 14 feet in length, with large individuals well documented in the deeper estuary sections. They use reed beds as primary daytime concealment, holding position in extremely shallow water alongside internal channels where dense vegetation breaks their outline entirely. A large animal resting just inside that reed bed would have produced no surface disturbance and would have been completely invisible from the bank at any distance. The crocodile came through the channel margin and seized her before she could react. Family members heard her cry out from the direction of the reeds and moved immediately toward her position, but she was already gone from the bank by the time they arrived. Emergency services were contacted without delay. Conservation officers and a local search team reached the area within the hour and worked the estuary by boat through the afternoon and into the night. Cameras narrow attention to whatever is inside the frame. Everything outside it disappears, and that is exactly where the crocodile was. Rebecca's remains were recovered the following morning, approximately half a mile from the point of the attack. Investigators concluded that the injuries were consistent with a fatal Nile crocodile attack. Because the attack was unwitnessed after the initial seizure and recovery occurred the following day, it was not possible to determine the precise precise sequence of fatal injuries. In the days following the incident, officials renewed existing warnings and used the incident as a reminder that the reed margins along the estuary shoreline are active crocodile habitat at all times, and that moving beyond designated viewing areas significantly increases exposure. Photography groups operating in the region were advised to keep a second person monitoring the surrounding environment whenever shooting near the water's edge. She was one of the most observant people in her family. The crocodile was feet away and she never saw it. That is how complete the concealment was.